This video aims to be a very quick introduction to the theme of the resistance against apartheid during the 1950s and the early 1960s. It is part of a series of videos of apartheid in South Africa, and therefore I'm not going to waste a lot of time going into a lot of contextual information about how apartheid came about and its influence in South Africa. There are other videos that you can look at on this channel that deal with that. I'm also going to make a much longer video on the influence of the Second World War in South Africa, and in that video I'm also going to look at this theme, the resistance against apartheid, in a lot more detail as well. This video just is a quick overview of some of the key issues of this theme. Now, the organization that led the struggle against apartheid during the 1950s and 1960s and continuing up until the end of apartheid was the African National Congress, or the ANC. It was established in 1912 as a South African Native National Congress. And the organization, from the period of its establishment in 1912 up until the Second World War in 1939, was a very different organization than the organization that would emerge at the end of the Second World War. The precursor to the ANC, or the African National Congress, that was established in 1912, was established 2 years after the Union of South Africa was established to fight for African rights. But it was an organization that fought using very conservative means. It was, think of it as being a very polite organization that used deputations and petitions to get the state to recognize the rights of Africans. It was also an elite organization that was not really representative of the masses. And as a consequence, its impact was very limited. During the Second World War, the president of the ANC, Alfred Kluma, he aimed to change that image of the ANC. He wanted it to be a more active, more virile organization. And he rewrote the constitution during his time as president during the Second World War, in which he allowed the youth to establish an ANC Congress Youth League. He also allowed women for the first time to be fully fledged members of the ANC, and they established the ANC Women's League as well. And he introduced a lot of important changes. Now, also very important during the Second World War is that the mobilization, trade unions became a lot more active. There were influx control laws in South Africa which restricted the movement of black people to the urban areas. So most stayed confined to the rural areas. But during the Second World War, when there was a huge need for manufacturing of war resources, these influx control laws were relaxed. At the time, South Africa also had a drought, and a lot of African people came into the urban areas. And as a consequence, the state relaxed its influx control laws. It would not have been practical to try and throw these people in prison, further cripple the economy, overflow the prisons. So instead, these people came to urban areas and contributed immensely to the workforce. But they also experienced a lot of squalid conditions in the urban areas. There was lack of housing for them. They became more militant. They organized themselves into trade unions. So this was a very important time, at the same time that Alfred Kluma is reorganizing the African National Congress. Also very important during the Second World War is the fact that the ANC Youth League was established in 1944, 1 year before the Second World War came to an end. And they also wanted to make the ANC into a different organization. They were fed up of the gradualist, polite methods that what they would refer to as the old guard of the ANC were using, and they wanted a more active militant organization that used boycotts, disobedience, mass protests, mass mobilization to force the state to make change. They were fed up and they were impatient with the slow, almost non-existent progress of the ANC leading up until the Second World War. Then, straight after the Second World War, apartheid is established. The National Party win the 1948 elections on the promise about making sure that racial segregation in South Africa not only continues, but becomes even more entrenched. Separate all South Africans in all spheres of life. This forced liberation leaders to really start to galvanize and really start to want to coordinate their fight against this new, even more oppressive regime than the old, this new apartheid regime. In 1949, the ANC had a major conference. And in this conference, the ANC Youth League managed to get the ANC to adopt their program of action. Their program of action was a more radical way of fighting against the state. It put boycotts, mass protests, civil disobedience as the most important method of getting the state to recognize the rights of Africans. And it was an important moment when the ANC officially adopted this program of action. They also, ironically, even though it was under Nkrumah's leadership that the ANC Youth League was established, they felt that he still was representative of the old guard. He was still too gradualist. He didn't want to get really radical to the extent that they wanted to. So they played an important role in getting him replaced at this conference as ANC president by J.S. Moroka, who they felt at the time was more progressive. Also important in this conference is that three very important members of the ANC Youth League, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, would be put in the ANC executive at this point in time. Now, in 1948, when the National Party did come to power, the leaders of many of the different liberation organizations felt that it would make sense to coordinate their struggles. Instead of fighting separately against this new, very powerful apartheid state, rather work together. This was actually quite controversial. The African National Congress had been an exclusively African organization, and now it's going to work closely with different groups. The Congress of Democrats, which is a wide organization, the South African Indian Congress, which is an Indian organization, and the Communist Party of South Africa. And this would be quite a revolutionary moment. Nkrumah was a supporter of this, and in fact, he, with Yusuf Dadoo and Monty Naika, the presidents of the Transvaal and Natal Indian Congresses, signed what was known as the Three Doctors Pact, because all three of them were medical doctors, which sought greater coordination and cooperation between their organizations, because they felt, they're fighting a powerful apartheid state. It would be more effective if they coordinate their struggles against this very powerful enemy rather than fight separately. Now, the ANC Youth League, which was established by Anton Lebede in 1944, was an Africanist organization. It had an Africanist philosophy. Differences amongst individuals about the extent of this. Some would have hurl the white man into the sea. Some would say, well, maybe that's a bit extreme, but we'd prefer if they leave. But it was very much an Africanist organization that said Africans should fight in their struggle alone, and they should not work with other groups. They were critical of working with white liberals or with Indians who they felt do not face the same amount of discrimination that they do, but would want to lead the struggle and tell Africans how to fight. Now, that's the founding of the ANC Youth League. And in fact, many of the members, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, had this philosophy in 1944 when the ANC Youth League was established. Anton Lebede, who was the founder of the Youth League, he passed away in 1947 at age 33. So it was very uncertain if he would have continued with this Africanist philosophy. But the other leaders of the ANC Youth League, not all, but Mandela, Sisulu, and Tambo, they changed stances in the 1950s. Whereas they had this very Africanist element, by the 1950s, they felt it was more effective to work with other groups and coordinate their efforts with other people who opposed apartheid rather than remain committed to this Africanist agenda. But not all members of the Youth League would have this attitude, and this would lead later on to a split in 1959 in the ANC and another organization, the PAC, being established. But just one thing that's important to note is, although the ANC Youth League did have this philosophy, and Anton Lebede was the leader of the Youth League, he passed away very quickly, 1947, age 33, and it's uncertain if he would have followed the route of Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, or if he would have remained committed to this Africanist philosophy. But we do know that he did pass away, and in 1949, the ANC Youth League's program of action was adopted by the ANC, and 1950 would be the first time in which they would test this new method of fighting against the apartheid state. Now, two very important events happened prior to this. At the end of the Second World War, in 1946, one was the Indian Passive Resistance Campaign, and the other was the African Mine Workers Strike. Why they were significant? Both examples showed that it was possible in South Africa to mass mobilize people. This is the direction that the ANC wanted to go in. This is the direction that the ANC Youth League, with their program of action, wanted to go in. So it was possible that to mass mobilize. So they were going to experiment. On the 1st of May 1950, the Communist Party of South Africa, the Transvaal Indian Congress, and the African National Congress organized in the Witwatersrand a workers' stay at home, and they stopped all industry except mining on the 1st of May. And this was the first major attempt to test out this new method of fighting against the oppressive state, or fighting against the apartheid state. In response, the police fired at protesters in various parts of the Witwatersrand area, and they killed 18. Few days later, on the 26th of June, the liberation movement again sought to have a national day of protest and mourning, spread this countrywide against the killings of the 1st of May 1950, and also against the law that had been passed, which I mentioned in a previous video, which was the Suppression of Communist Act, originally called the Unlawful Organization Bill. And this law banned the Communist Party of South Africa, and also gave the Minister of Justice the power to imprison someone without trial, and on charges of being a communist, whether or not that person actually was a communist. He could define communism very loosely. During this protest, Oliver Tambo, who was an important member of the ANC and the ANC Youth League, said quite prophetically, because this has actually come true, he says, today they will ban the Communist Party of South Africa, but tomorrow they'll ban the Indian Congresses, they'll ban the African National Congress, they'll ban the APO, and his words actually ended up coming true when in 1960 they did ban the PAC and the ANC. But anyway, this was what happened on the 26th of June 1950. Also interesting during this time now is that the Communist Party of South Africa would be banned. ANC Youth League, which was an Africanist organization, was also opposed to the Communist Party of South Africa because they felt that these are foreign influences. Anton Ubede had an idea that prior to colonization, there was this thing, the concept of African socialism, but the whole communism is the type of communism that the Communist Party of South Africa would preach is a very foreign element that does not belong in South Africa. But now, during the 50s, as I say, the ANC is working with other national groups or racial groups and working with the Communist Party of South Africa, because the Communist Party of South Africa, or I'll say former members, because it's now banned, and the organization actually decided to dissolve itself after the Suppression of Communist Act was passed, because they didn't want to put their members, basically make their members illegal and get them imprisoned by virtue of belonging to the organization. And they weren't ready to operate illegally, so they disbanded the organization, but its leaders decided to move to other organizations like the African National Congress or like trade unions that play an important role in the struggle against apartheid. The first main campaign against apartheid took place in 1952. At the end of 1951, a joint organizing committee made up of the African National Congress and the South African Indian Congress planned a campaign against 6 unjust laws passed by the apartheid state. The 6 laws were the stock limitation laws, the pass laws, the Separate Representation of Voters Act, which sought to eliminate the colored franchise, the Bantu Authorities Act, the Suppression of Communism Act, and the Group Areas Act. This campaign, they issued an ultimatum to the South African state, to DF Milan, to say you repeal these 6 unjust laws or else be met by a campaign of defiance against them. Now, they obviously expected the state not to repeal the laws, but they were prepared for a defiance campaign. But even before the Defiance Campaign would begin on the 26th of June, 1952, there was already on the 6th of April, mass rallies throughout the country. The 6th of April, 1952 was the 300th year anniversary of the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck in South Africa on the 6th of April, 1652. So while white South Africa was celebrating the arrival of van Riebeeck, those who resisted against apartheid portrayed this as like celebrating 300 years of exploitation and minority rule. And they argued that all those who fought against colonialism and resistance were not being commemorated, and they sought these rallies against the celebrations of Van Riebeck's arrival. On the 26th of June 1952, 2 years after the 26th of June 1950 National Day of Protest and Mourning that we spoke about previously, the Defiance Campaign would begin. And the purpose of the Defiance Campaign was for volunteers to actively defy apartheid laws. So go into the Bantustans or the African reserves without the required documentation. Different racial groups would stand in the lines that they were not allowed to, and they would invite arrest. And the idea is that they would show the state that these are unjust laws, and they fight against it, they get arrested, overflow the prison stations, cripple the economies. And you can think of the Defiance Campaign in two ways. You can see of it as not being successful in the sense that it didn't repel any of the 6 unjust laws. The state would not do that. But it was a success in the mass participation of people who joined. It completely changed the image of the African National Congress. 8,500 people were arrested during the Defiance Campaign. So in that regard, it was a massive success. It was called off at the end of 1952. By November, there was too much violence that was taking place. Too much violence that was a consequence. People like Nelson Mandela said that this violence was done not by volunteers of the Defiance Campaign, but by agent provocateurs who were being financed by the apartheid state to make it violent, to discredit the Defiance Campaign. But at the end of the Defiance Campaign, the whole image of the African National Congress was changed. Prior to the Defiance Campaign, there was about 7,000 paid up members of the African National Congress. By the end of 1952, as a consequence of the Defiance Campaign, it had risen to 100,000 fully paid up members of the ANC. So it went from a small organization into a mass organization. So in that regard, the Defiance Campaign was a major success. And this can also be illustrated by a number of quotations. One quotation by an individual who's being interviewed about why he joined the ANC. And this is a quotation, and this is in the book by John Pampalis, if you want to read that chapter. But the quote is, "I started joining the ranks exactly when I saw that now the ANC was on the stand of making some protest with the government, that people now were practically taking a certain line. 1952, Defiance Campaign. Then I enlisted my name. But 1949, when they asked me to do so, I refused because I said they were always asking for, quote, point of order, Mr. Chairman, end of quote. Their meeting was just becoming a flop all the time. Because of such things, I felt no, I could not join such things. 1952, when they started taking action, then I joined their ranks in Brakpan. Before 1952, the African National Congress was not taken as a very serious organization that could do the government any harm. But 1952, they started seeing that things were becoming hot, that the people were being called on to defy. Then even some of the teachers started to go behind the doors, started joining the ANC." So that quotation tells you that how the image of the ANC had changed. As I said earlier, before the Second World War, the ANC had this image of an elite organization of professionals who were not representative. It was a very fancy organization. Ordinary people did not feel like it represented them. And even at the end of the Second World War, the ANC was trying to become more radical, more of a mass organization, more of a militant organization. It still struggled to change that image, but the Defiance Campaign had managed to change that image. And after the Defiance Campaign, lots of ordinary people not only felt that they could be part of the ANC, but also felt that the ANC was actually something that was worth being a part of. A quotation from Nelson Mandela about the importance of the Defiance Campaign, which echoes the same sentiments, is that the ANC was more talk than action. The ANC was more talk than action. We had no paid organizers, no staff, and a membership that did little more than pay lip service to our cause. As a result of the campaign, obviously talking about the Defiance Campaign, our membership swelled up to 100,000 from less than 7,000. The ANC emerged as a truly mass-based organization with an impressive corps of experienced activists who braved the police, courts, and jails. the stigma usually associated with imprisonment had been removed, and this was a significant achievement, for fear of a prison is a tremendous hindrance to the liberation struggle. So this quote from Nelson Mandela also shows the importance of the Defiance Campaign in actually changing the way in which the struggle against apartheid is going to take place. After the Defiance Campaign, there wasn't a lot of more examples of mass protests just yet, up until the adoption of the um, Freedom Charter. Just two other examples of protests against apartheid, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this specific video. One was a boycott against the Bantu Education Act. This one was not that successful because parents were reluctant to stop their children from going to school, even though Bantu Education Act promised an inferior quantity or quality of education for their children. It still wasn't education, and to keep their children out of school and to kind of limit their future was something that parents were a bit reluctant to, so the support for that was not as high as it could be. Another instance was when the decision of, or one of the consequences of the implementation of forced removals, where the decision to destroy Sophiatown and resettle its African inhabitants into meadowlands in Soweto, people protested against that, but the state responded by sending in 2,000 troops and 70 trucks to forcibly remove these people. So these are just some instances. 1953, Z.K. Matthews wanted a Congress of the People to establish, to put forward a path for a more democratic South Africa. And the leading organizations now, the African National Congress, the South African Indian Congress. At this stage, the African People's Organization had kind of fallen away, but a new organization, the South African Colored People's Organization, was established, and the Congress of Democrats, which was a white organization. These different organizations now working together in like the Congress Alliance got volunteers together to go out throughout the country to interview as many people as they can: domestic workers, mine workers, professional class, peasants, people in rural areas, factory workers, as many as they can, and ask them what they want for a future South Africa. And then they were going to document this into an official set of principles for a new South Africa, which would become known as the Freedom Charter. Now, the state wanted to prevent this, and a lot of the key leaders had banning orders which prevented them from traveling. But in spite of this, in 1955, in Kliptown, just outside Johannesburg, 3,000 delegates attended, known as the Congress of the People. And clause by clause, they went through each one of these proposed clauses in this Freedom Charter document, which was basically what the people of South Africa had said they want for a future South Africa. Even though it was supposed to be very democratic and get the views of ordinary South Africans, it would have had an organizing committee summarize these viewpoints into one official document. So critics of the Freedom Charter could say, no, the individuals that compiled it were putting their own Marxist or communist influences into this. But nonetheless, this Freedom Charter was adopted by the Congress of People, but the police did break up this delegation of the Congress of the People, and then they put the leaders in trial for treason, an event that will become known as the Treason Trial. But something that's important to take note about this Freedom Charter is that there was a group in the African National Congress who were not happy with the direction that the ANC had been moving in. And the Freedom Charter solidified their unhappiness. There were a lot of clauses in the Freedom Charter that they were not happy with. One, it said South Africa belongs to all who live within it. And the Africanist argument would be, no, South Africa belongs to Africans. They were not in favor of working with other groups. Now, again, this is kind of controversial because exactly what their viewpoint is a bit difficult to determine. They could criticize the Freedom Charter on grounds that it makes clauses for each racial group. So the idea is that each racial group gets equal representation, whereas they want a fully democratic South Africa under an African democratic government, whereas Africans are the majority. So they want a democratic African government, and they don't want each racial group to have equal rights. They want everyone who lives in South Africa to recognize the supreme authority of a democratic government, which would be an African government. So there is a bit of nuance in the extent to which the Africanist elements were committed and their critiques of the Freedom Charter. Another thing about the Freedom Charter that upset them is that it was a lot of talk about sharing the country's resources and nationalization, and it sounded like these were foreign communist or Marxist elements, and the Africanist element within the ANC was very anti-communist. The ANC Youth League was opposed to communism, saw it as a foreign ideology. So this really upset a lot of the Africanists, which is just something to take note of. Now, what's going on at this time is the treason trial. The state is going to accuse many of the leaders of the Congress Alliance of high treason against the state, and they're going to be put under treason trial. But something also important to take note that's going to happen at the same time is the women's campaigns. Now, the ANC Youth League the ANC Women's League was established during Nkrumah's presidency, and a non-racial Federation of South African Women were also established. Now, when this apartheid state came and wanted to impose passes on women as well, at the end of 1955, on the 27th of October 1955, they led 2,000 women to march throughout Pretoria to protest against this. The following year, on the 9th of August 1956, they had assembled 20,000 women volunteers to march to Parliament Building to give Stratham a petition. Now, Stratham refused to meet them, and they did tell Stratham, "You have struck a woman, you have struck a rock." And it was a very important moment, because 20,000 people, 20,000 women gathered on Parliament Building to protest against the PAS laws. Today, that is celebrated as Women's Day. Also, now, as a consequence of the Freedom Charter, you got the treason trial. Now, the treason trial kind of backfired in the apartheid state's face, because on one hand, they wanted to accuse the leaders of the Congress Alliance of high treason with this Freedom Charter document. But most of the leaders in the Congress Alliance, like Nelson Mandela, like Oliver Tambo, were trained lawyers. And they did a very good job defending themselves. And they actually humiliated the apartheid state. Another thing is that it helped galvanize, because during the court cases, volunteers would go outside the courts, scanned with signs saying, "We support our leaders." So it actually helped to mobilize people to support, the leaders who were put under treason trial. So during the treason trial, while many of the key African National Congress leaders were forbidden from traveling, forbidden from attending meetings because they were on trial, another group within the ANC thought that this would be their moment to take charge. Now, this group are the Africanists. Many of them were key leaders of the Youth League during the late 1940s. But during the 1950s, during the Defiance Campaign, the formation of the Congress Alliance, the Freedom Charter, the Congress of the People, their importance within the organization began to dwindle as the ANC began to move in a multiracial direction, and also work closely with former members of the Communist Party of South Africa. This group of Africanists have felt that the ANC had abandoned its true philosophy, which was Africanist philosophy. And now they sought to use this moment, the treason trial, while the other leaders were forbidden from traveling and attending meetings, to take control of the ANC. In 1958, they attempted this. It wasn't successful. At one ANC conference, there was a lot of fighting and commotion. They decided to break away and establish another organization called the Pan-African Congress. And in 1959, the Pan-African Congress was established, led by Potlako Lobalo and Robert Sobukwe. Now, the Pan-African Congress, they felt that their organization would grow rapidly, and that the African people would realize that they are the true voice of the Africans against apartheid in South Africa, and not the ANC. But their membership did not grow at the rate in which they anticipated. They had predicted by mid-1959 a membership of 100,000, but as late as December 1959, the membership was about 30,000. So they were desperately looking for something just like how the Defiance Campaign transformed the ANC from a small organization, 7,000, to a large organization, 100,000. They were looking for something similar. In the 1959 ANC conference, they were promoting a new program for the following year, which would begin with a end of March anti-pass demonstration, building upon what was left off by the Women's March in 1956. When the PAC heard about this, they felt that it was their opportunity to preempt the ANC and launched on the 21st of March an anti-pass demonstration. And they felt that a pass demonstration would be the best type of demonstration to get people to join the PAC, because it was exclusively Africans who had to carry passes, not whites, liberals, not Indians, not colors, but Africans who in South Africa who would have to carry passes. So they thought that this would be their moment to have an anti-pass demonstration, and people would present themselves before police station without their passes, be arrested, overflood the police stations due to a lack of jail space, cripple the economy, and they had a very ambitious timeline for when apartheid would be dismantled. One area where there was strong support for the PAC's anti-pass demonstration was a township called Sharpeville. And in Sharpeville, stories vary a little bit, but it's estimated that at least a crowd of 7,000 presented themselves before the police station. Now, the police officers who were there were very junior, very nervous, and they had heard reports recently of police killings that had taken place in a demonstration in Cato Manor, and they were afraid that something similar could happen. At this police station, they ended up opening fire on the crowd. Now, the crowd had not attacked the police, but the police had opened fire, and the shooting lasted for an uncomfortable amount of time. And when the shooting had stopped, the result was 69 people shot dead and 180 wounded. And the victims had been shot in the back, which meant that the crowd had dispersed and tried to run away, and the police shot at people who were fleeing, people who are running away. There's no way that the state can justify this, the police shooting at people who are running away. If people are attacking and they're a threat, it's a different story. But if they turn around and run away and they're shot in the back, this is a major crisis. This will introduce a huge crisis in the country, and it's going to cause countrywide riots. In Cape Town, a young PAC leader, Philip Kosaga, will lead a huge march of 30,000 people to Cape Town. And he would be persuaded by the police that if he tells the crowd to disband and go back home, he'd get a meeting with the Minister of Justice. And he did what they asked him to, but they didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. And instead of a meeting with the Minister of Justice, he was arrested. And the state responded now after Sharpeville by really stepping up their repressive measures. They introduced a state of emergency. They made it illegal for police to take leave. They passed new, very rigid laws to really clamp down on individuals. They outright banned the ANC and they banned the PAC. And for this next period from the 21st of March, 1960, when the Sharpeville Massacre happened, up until the 16th of December, 1961, the state had made it almost impossible for the liberation movement to continue to fight. And various liberation movements began to start contemplating or talking about having armed wings. The African National Congress would launch Umkhonto we Sizwe, a Spear of the Nation. It wasn't the ANC. The ANC is not deciding to become violent, but their argument is that violence is going to be inevitable, and rather establish an organization that can coordinate the violence and bring it under responsible leadership where it can be used effectively than having it uncoordinated. And like at this stage, people like Nelson Mandela began to really see non-violence is no longer the solution. His argument was that apartheid was the most immoral thing, and he always favored non-violence as a means of fighting apartheid because it was an effective weapon. If the state is attacking and the protesters respond by defying the state in a non-violent strategy, it's a very powerful weapon. It shows the international community who is at fault in South Africa, who are the real terrorists, so to say. But at this stage, Mandela began to not just Mandela, but other leaders like him began to feel that remaining committed to nonviolence is just not going to amount to anything. And he says the stage has come where we either have two options, submit or fight, and we're not going to submit, so we have to fight. So this was the thinking behind an armed wing. And the whole idea of having an armed wing was, well, there were different armed wings, but the Umkhonto we Sizwe was about not necessarily attacking people and killing human beings or fighting the apartheid state, which would be an ineffective strategy. The apartheid state has got far superior weapons, machinery, military equipment, but rather to destroy infrastructure, state infrastructure, blow up power stations, petrol stations, make the country a place of chaos. So it will cripple the economy. For apartheid to work, you need international support, foreign investment. If things are blowing up in the country, it becomes a place which is not a good investment. And foreign investors will pull out of South Africa, ruin the economy, and this is their means of fighting apartheid. Now, Albert Lutuli, who had become ANC president in the aftermath of the Defiance Campaign, where he replaced J.S. Moroka, who many felt had sold out during the trials after the Defiance Campaign, Albert Lutuli remained committed to nonviolence, and him and Mandela would argue about this. And his argument was that once the liberation movement resorts to violence, it becomes easier for the apartheid state to legitimize the liberation movement. And one thing that did happen in the aftermath of launching Umkhonto we Sizwe on the 16th of December 1961, 16th of December, the Battle of Blood River, where the Boers had defeated the Zulus in a major battle. After this, the apartheid state really did an effective job in crushing the liberation movement and arresting most of the leaders. Nelson Mandela would be arrested in 1962 on charges of leaving the country illegally and various other charges they had on him. But when they discovered documents in Lili's farm, they would use this to associate many of the key leaders with Umkhonto we Sizwe and sentence them to death, which was later changed to life imprisonment. And in 1964, the Rivonia Trial took place, and most of the liberation leaders would either be arrested in life imprisonment or would have to go in exile and leave the country to escape imprisonment. And this would be in kind of brief end to the liberation movement for a period of time, up until the Soweto uprising, which I do have other videos on. This video now has just been a very quick introduction to this period of liberation movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. I'm going to make a longer video on which will probably be more than an hour, which will really look in more detail this period in South African history, 1948 to 1964. So have a look at that video that will come out shortly. Thank you.